Hello.
This is the ocean. It's very nice to hear you.
Nice to meet you too.
Okay, I think all of our students are gathering here. And we can start.
Yeah, let's begin. It's morning here in Moscow. It's already daytime in Xian. Let me open my presentation. So today we have a lecture which is going to continue what we were talking about last time. And there is quite a lot of information here. You will find some slides really full of text. So maybe later, if you want to use some of the data, you can just consult this presentation, okay? So let's begin right away because we have quite a lot to cover. So what we're going to talk about, the content of today's topic will go like this. So first of all, we will discuss the Soviet-Chinese relations and the cultural diplomacy therein, the periods it can be divided into. Then we will again revise the idea of what soft power is and how it can be measured. Yeah, what countries exert more soft power, what countries are allegedly less successful in this field. And then we're going to touch upon what Russia does in terms of soft power and what China does and what problems exist. So let's start. Well, of course, the relationships between Russian state and Chinese state existed before the communist wave arrived into Europe, but clearly the Russian Revolution was a shattering event of the 20th century. It was a very, like a wave that really swept what existed in Russia before and really transformed the country completely. But it was important globally as well, because, Russian Empire collapsed. It immediately had an effect on the war it was taking part, the First World War. It had impact on, the system of power in Europe, and not only in Europe, of course. So what happened? Why did this happen? Well, there are many reasons. In Russia, serfdom existed for quite a long time, meaning there were landlords who owned the land, and there were peasants who were working on this land, but who did not own it, or did not even own their own labor, right? So Russia industrialized late. Yeah, so the railway and the plants, all of this was, built in a very rapid manner. And the country was quite poor because there were constant wars. So we had a war in Japan in 1904 and 1905. We lost this war. Then, of course, we entered the World War I, even though the country was already poor. And, little by little, there were more, workers who were free laborers, who were not peasants anymore, and they were protesting. And you had the Emperor Nicholas II, who finally abdicated, so he left the throne. And there was a Duma, like, a Congress in a sense, like a parliament, one-chamber parliament. But it had really little power at first. And at first you had just some people who represented the capitalist bourgeoisie, yeah, some people who owned actually the means of production. And these people came from Moscow and St. Petersburg. So they formed the provisional government. But then Lenin came and he said, no, we don't want these people to just, like a little group of intellectuals to decide on how this country should be, governed. Because they actually suggested the liberal rights for everyone. So let's say if they won back then, maybe we would have a different political system in Russia now. But, history cannot be talked about in this way. But what's more, they did not end the war. So this capitalist group of people, they did not want to withdraw Russia from the First World War, and they did not really hurry up with carrying out the reforms. So people were not happy. So basically, Lenin led a bloodless coup. No one really suffered. Lenin had quite enough of forces behind him, some soldiers, and his idea would be that Russia from now on, Soviet Union, would be ruled directly by councils of soldiers, peasants, and workers, right? So there would be no mediators between them, no some kind of privileged bodies that would decide what to do. Yeah, they would represent directly the people. And so there was an idea of so-called democratic centralism that was later also used for formation of the China's Communist Party. The idea is that yes, there is a debate, there is freedom of political speech, but up to the point you reach a consensus. When you reach a consensus, you arrive at a certain solution, you cannot, question it anymore. The pictures you have here, this is the family of Nicholas I. The whole family was shot dead. And these are some of the protests in St. Petersburg. Later on, a civil revolution erupted in Russia because there were still some people who were supporting the Tsar, and it lasted for several years. But let's see how it affected our relationships with China. So basically, in China, people were following what was going on in Russia. And many people who were educated, who belonged to, academia, who were literate, they started reading Lenin specifically because, the imperial rule in China was also not particularly strong, partly because there were many foreign powers from the West, such as Great Britain, France, Spain, that were having some possessions in China. So there was no strong rule anymore. And basically, yes, the Russians, when after the revolution, they were trying to reach out to China and they were trying to establish diplomatic ties. Eventually, they were established. And some Chinese journalists, some teachers, they were studying, going to Moscow, to Russia, to see how education system is being formed in the new state of the Soviet Union. Some Soviet teachers were also coming to Beijing to teach Russian at the university. Then finally, we had a treaty signed in 1924, where we agreed on some, territories, the demarcation of the borders, because we have quite a long border, you can see on the picture, with Russia, China, they share a border, and there were always some issues, because the border was not always set. China claimed it, has the right to possess some territories that currently belong to Russia. Yeah. So what Russia did basically, because Imperial Russia also had some possessions in China, like it had Port Arthur, for example. And basically Russia gave it up. Yeah. So the idea was we treat China as an equal partner. And for China, that was a lot. That was like a breakthrough because no other country, no other imperial power would treat China equally, right? So for example, China did not have ambassadors in other countries, but in Soviet Russia, it started having one, because China was not treated as an equal state. So Western powers who were, doing something in China, exerting their colonial influence, they did not accept ambassadors from China. Yeah, so what else? The Society of Cultural Ties was established. First of all, it was a Society of Soviet-Russian Friendship. Then later on, you had like also an organization that would represent Chinese culture in Russia. And, language courses appeared, exhibitions, movies, especially if you look at okay, I might have a problem with pronouncing some Chinese names, but you see the Northwest China, the region that borders Russia and that bordered Soviet Union at that time. There in particular, you had many Russian language schools, you had an intense cultural exchange, etc. Okay, now here on the picture you see some Soviet troops in Manchuria because Russians, of course, they were helping Chinese to liberate the country from Japanese occupation forces. Some of the quotes. So as I mentioned, people in China really started reading Lenin and generally Russian literature. But of course, you needed people who would translate things from Russian into Chinese. So one of those intellectuals was a communist, or correct me, Su Suibai. So basically, he traveled to Moscow and he edited books of, collected stories, works by Russian writers. And he said that indeed the Russian situation has some resemblance to what's happening in China. And maybe China should pay close attention, to what's going on. Perhaps you know Chinese history of this period better than I do, but anyway, I'm going to cover it briefly. So you can see the scale. In these 50 years, the first 50 years of the 20th century, over 500 works on Marxism, Leninism were translated into Chinese. You had more than 45 friendship societies that were established in China by 1946. And clearly, of course, Mao Zedong himself also was greatly affected by the Russian thought, even though he was more of a, homegrown intellectual in this sense. He was not standing at the, foundation of the party. He was not a key leader when the party only was organized in 1921, but gradually he gained some influence. And he was kind of special in the sense that he resisted some social norms that were supposed to be followed back then. So he wanted really to continue education, even though he came from quite a poor background. And he had this idea that indeed you have to look at peasants. And this was a real similarity. So this was an idea that he borrowed from Leninism, because Karl Marx, he was coming from Germany, and he thought that you would have a proletarian revolution led by workers, who were working on the plants, in a society that is already a capitalist one. But neither Russia nor China were these kinds of societies. Russia and China both were largely agrarian societies where you had, peasants working on the land without really possessing anything, right? And Mao Zedong, he agreed on that point. He also recognized the potential in, peasantry, but he also understood that you cannot really just blindly imitate the path that is followed by Russia, because China has its unique, consequences, the unique features of its situation. Yeah. You see some interesting picture. Yeah, you have this book by Bruce Elliman. Yeah, we're going to go on that, talk about that later, but basically he is talking about some geopolitical aspects of why Russia decided to support communists, because initially in the Chinese Civil War, Soviets, they were not quite sure whom to support. But let's see what was going on in China. So, okay, the emperor was deposed in the revolution of 1911. And you had Sun Yat-sen, who was leading the Revolutionary Alliance. And basically you had both nationalists, the Kuomintang party, and you had the communists. They were just popping up, just consolidating. And because they basically had some common goals at some stages, so for example, when Japanese invaded in 1937, they had to fight together, but they had some disagreements. So Stalin also helped these two groups to stay together at some point. But then, in 1949, basically Mao Zedong, the communists, they won, and Chiang Kai-shek, who succeeded Sun Yat-sen, he had to flee to Taiwan, right? And the People's Republic of China was established. So before that, after the revolution, you had a different name. You had just a Republic of China. Now you had the People's Republic of China. And you can see this picture shows pretty well how China looked like at that period. So basically, China had absolutely no control over its own territory. Yeah, you can see some imperial powers sitting here. You see the Germans, you see the British, you see this is probably a Russian Tsar here, you see Japanese, yeah. So you maybe remember there were some opium wars in the end of the 19th century, yeah, when British, they were trading in opium with China, and it caused like a real big issue in China because people were smoking it. They were not, working or studying. There was like a disease, and it clearly affected everything that like happened in China later. When you have traumatic experiences of this kind, yeah, when you're being taken over by some other powers, it kind of leaves a scar, right? So let's see. As I mentioned, Soviets initially, they were not sure which side to support, whether they should be supporting nationalists, the Gomindan, or the communists, because it was not quite clear who of them is stronger, who is going to take over. And I mean, yeah, of course, communist ideology was important, but still geopolitics plays its role, and you always have to be pragmatic. Okay, so when finally the communists won, America was supporting nationalists in this war, so it was supporting Chiang Kai-shek. But then American support ended completely. And basically, the Soviet Union had to help China financially, and like in many other respects, the Soviet Union had to help China. But you can imagine, the Soviet Union just ended this Second World War. First, we fought in Europe. Then we had to join the Second Front in Asia to find Japan. And it was crazy. Like so many people just died, and the economy was in shatters. Like the economy was nearly non-existent. And yet you have another, drifting into your orbit, so to say, another country that is now communist and shares your ideology, and you have to support it as well. And of course, it was an unbearable burden for the Soviet Union. So basically, citizens of the Soviet Union suffered a lot because the state was helping some other, peoples outside of it, which is a questionable decision, which is a questionable practice, but this is how it was. So again, you had another treaty signed between Russia and China. And then you had this issue with Korean War, which was quite a complicated one, because basically the communists in North Korea, they were moving into South Korea, and there was an international response. So the forces of the United Nations moved in, but Stalin was reluctant to actually send Soviet troops. So he basically just asked Mao Zedong to be a proxy, to back North Korean forces, and Mao was not very happy about that because he thought it's like kind of a betrayal, maybe. You don't want to. Of course, Soviet Union was supporting Chinese troops. It was not very far. You see Soviet Union somewhere here, but still, that was quite an incident. So let's now turn to actually the cultural diplomacy. Well, so this period from the establishment of the People's Republic of China up until 1960 was a period of friendship and cooperation. You can see some nice posters here. Friendship, this is the for 10 years of creation of People's Republic. So of course you always have altruistic goals, like, for the good of humanity, for everyone to understand one another better, to just have a profitable engagement, peaceful cultural cooperation between the states. But clearly you also have some national goals, right? Which might again be a problematic issue, because if you truly are a camp, if you truly fight for socialist revolution, for the arrival to socialism, ideally, in some future, perhaps you should be less wary of your private national goals, but this is a utopia. This is impossible because the state always has some paranoia. The state always has some security issues, right? So on the one hand, of course, China was a Cold War partner for Russia. Cold War was starting to emerge after the end of the Second World War. You know, Germany was divided into spheres of influence, but basically Soviet Union also, you know, stretched its hand over Eastern Europe. So there were some issues between the West and the Soviet Union, not so much trust. And yeah, so Soviet Union tried to back pro-communism in China as much as it could, but it also wanted to make China ideologically dependent, yeah, to treat it as a sort of a younger brother. So for that, I mean, of course, you always had to prove that Soviet Union has an upper hand in terms of, you know, what models of building of socialism should be applied. And it also had some economic benefits because it had very favorable trade terms with China. Although, of course, you know, Soviet Union was helping China a lot. The trade balance was not equal at all, right? So, for example, Soviet Union would supply some industrial goods, would actually send the experts who would help to set up some plants, yeah, to electrify the country, to whatever. And then China would send back some raw materials, yeah, some kind of food or maybe, I don't know, something of this kind. This is a very interesting document. You see, there is a lot of text. You can later look closer. It is. I found this document in the archive of the Wilson Center. It's an American think tank. And basically, this is a note, a letter from a head of a delegation of Chinese scientists to Moscow. And it's quite interesting if you read it, because you find out that, you know, there are some people who are kind of influenced already by the Western ideology. There are some people who are communists, but this person who is in charge of the delegation, he's he's like informing Soviet comrades of what should be done to re-educate the people, because maybe some of them are not very devoted to the communist cause. And so basically this note reads that, okay, so Chinese scientists were very much impressed by the level of development of the Soviet Union, even though not many of them were highly qualified, but anyway. However, when it comes to ideology, not everyone was really, you know, agreeing with what Soviet Union had to offer. And so basically this person also says that, of course, you know, we represent different nationalities, we come from different states, but we all belong to the same Communist Party. You had this Comintern organization, which was holding you know, annual meetings of all the Communist Party in the world, not just Russia and China, but elsewhere as well. And you can just kind of feel the spirit of the time. So you see Soviet science must occupy first place, which will mean also that the first place for Chinese science, and the Soviets have to show the Chinese the way. But again, what I just find curious here is that, you know, some people were more inclined towards individualism in China back then too. Yeah. So some scientists, they were not quite sure if it's good to be ideologically engaged. And then something happened. This was quite a blow to the international socialist movement. You know, scholars, historians, they argue what was the breaking point really. Stalin died in 1953. You can see here Mao Zedong actually came to Moscow, not surprisingly, for quite many times. He knew Stalin personally. But when Stalin died, there was a change of government in Russia. And Khrushchev was elected general secretary of the Communist Party. And on the 20th Congress, he said something that really created a rift between Russians and Chinese, because he said that what Stalin did was wrong. Yeah, that Stalin created a personality cult for himself, that he was repressing people for nothing. Yeah, innocent people. For example, actually, this is true. Like the people even who were captured in the Nazi camps during the Second World War, they were treated as traitors. So it was actually safer for them to stay in Europe, not to come back to Soviet Union, than to come back, because if you had some minor contacts with the foreigners, even if you just were captured, into a camp, you did not surrender, you just you did not choose, but you were still exposed to them. And Stalin, he had some personal issues, so he treated it as a problem, that these people need to be eliminated somehow. And Mao disagreed with that, and he could not accept that. He was accusing Soviet Union of abandoning actually the cause of building a proper socialism. And even though Khrushchev maintained positive relations initially, gradually they were deteriorating. So first, the Soviets were supporting China with nuclear technology. China was building its own nuclear bomb. But then the political tensions persisted, partly also because China had to justify its policy towards some other countries that fell under its sphere of influence in the Asian region, but also elsewhere in the third world. Because actually, China was gaining more influence globally in terms of, really given a direction to the global socialist movement. Some countries in Africa that were just being liberated from colonial forces, China was really supporting them too. So what happened is the so-called Sino-Soviet split. Yeah. So not anymore. China and Soviet Union were no longer on the same page, and they were pursuing different policies from now on. So here you see Khrushchev came to China, probably to Beijing. He's sitting here with Mao. And there were some other problems in the ensuing period as well. So, for example, the border disputes intensified. Again, there were some border conflicts, and you can look at it again as you know, because as soon as some issues emerged between Russia and China ideologically, the Chinese state again was, emphasizing some issues that were divisive rather than uniting, right? So, such as, for example, some of the islands to whom this island should belong, and there was quite a serious incident on the Ussuri River. I think it's like Zhenbao Island in Chinese. It's Damansky Island in Russian. So of course it was again a problem. Basically, if you're reading memoirs of some politicians of the time, you see that the Soviets were more afraid of China in its east than of some Western forces in the West. And you actually had some military forces being deployed to the border with China in that period, even though before we were like great friends and allies forever, etc. What else happened? Of course, China acquired finally the nuclear bomb in 1964. You can see some pictures. It was tested again in the same region of northwest border in Russia. Yeah, here you can see. This is actually the Zhenbao Island. This is here it is, this red spot on the map. And then the next period began here. So, yeah, Khrushchev was also quite an impulsive person. He was sometimes making some remarks that were not at all helping the relationship. He was insulting Mao personally. And at some point, he even withdrew all of the scientists and technical experts from China. Many technical, construction projects were canceled. The aid was reduced to basically zero. Um, that was also a period of the so-called Great Leap Forward. You probably know how it's called in Chinese. It was the second five-year plan, and really Mao aimed at industrializing China in a very, very short term. Yeah. So basically, it was a very a radical measure, really, and it failed. There were some miscalculations. There was hunger, and again, the government had to blame it all on the Soviet Union. What was happening is that no cultural diplomacy could be functional anymore, and because the interior propaganda in China was painting Soviet Union as an enemy after this Sino-Soviet split, that now Soviet Union strives to become a hegemon, it's a revisionist power, they are restoring capitalism, they're no longer with us, yeah, and so on. So there was a war of ideas. You had the Cold War, now you have actually three forces. Yeah. So you don't just have the socialist camp led by USSR and the capitalist camp led by the United States. Clearly, the US was in a very similar position to the USSR because, again, Europe after the war was completely destroyed. Yeah? So the United States had to invest in Europe a lot, partly also because of some of the security considerations. Right. So yeah, you can see also the picture from a Comintern Congress in 1960. Uh, you know, initially they were trying to conceal, not to let everybody know that there is a split between China and Russia. It would really, cause many problems. So they tried to hide it initially, not to tell it to other communist forces. So what happened next? Um, some minor cultural diplomacy was being carried out. The societies of friendship, they kept being active in Soviet Union, not in China anymore. In China, there are people who spoke Russian, the people who were teaching Russian, who had anything to do with Soviet Union. They were not in favor. They were punished. They were like repressed. But you also have to understand that Mao had now another idea. He wanted to, carry out a cultural revolution, and he actually endeavored on doing that. So again, basically, it was an idea to re-educate the population, to really embed the Marxist, socialist ideas into people's minds. So yes, you have to see what else. Basically, before this cooling down of relationships, for example, in China, the birthdays of some Russian writers were celebrated. So such writers as Leo Tolstoy or Anton Chekhov or Maxim Gorky. Maxim Gorky was a revolutionary writer. They were celebrated in China. You would celebrate the anniversaries of October Revolution. You can see actually this picture here. One of the key figures in China's political party went to Moscow in 1964. Yes, so basically no Russian language was taught in China anymore. No student exchanges were carried out any longer, but still, at least, to some extent, they were staying in touch. So the representative of Chinese Communist parties came to Moscow to attend the celebration of the 47th anniversary of October Revolution. But then when Mao dies in 1976, of course, the Cultural Revolution is brought to an end and many other things follow. Clearly, when China broke off its closeness with Soviet Union, it had a reason to say to the United States that we are now free, we can now have a closer relationship. The United States, Nixon basically was the president. They signed the Shanghai Declaration in 1972 saying that, okay, the United States understand that both Taiwan and People's Republic of China claim to represent the true China and would like, ideally, to have a China united under their political system. Yeah, so both Taiwan wanted it to represent China and the People's Republic, but United States committed not to interfere. Yeah, so the United States withdrew all its military support from Taiwan back then, and they established full diplomatic ties in 1979. Still, there were quite many issues, right? Such as, for example, the human rights abuses the United States. The United States also did it, of course, in the name of geopolitics. You can do whatever, but at least the official policy was not to accept any sort of crackdowns on, demonstrations by the people, such as the incident in Tiananmen Square in 1989, when people, went to the streets to protest, to ask for some democratization, because economically speaking, Deng Xiaoping, who came to power after Mao, he headed towards economic liberalization. If you look at the picture here at the graph, you can see that indeed the GDP, I'm not sure what kind of a GDP it is. I think maybe it's I think it's not per capita, it's just a general GDP. But anyway, that's quite an accurate picture. The growth was almost exponential, right? You see, really, the economic reforms made China much richer with time. Okay, what was happening in terms of cultural diplomacy here? So there was a period when many general secretaries who were quite old were just succeeding one another in the Soviet Union after Khrushchev was deposed, because Khrushchev was again accused by some other people in the Soviet Communist Party of really not being a wise politician. And after some time, in 1985, Gorbachev came to power, and it marked a change, a real turn. Because what happened? Basically, some people in Russia would say that he started to ruin the Soviet Union, but he suggested to restructure the economy and also the political system, because he understood that it's no longer tenable. You cannot go on like this. There were some real economic hardships. There was also this competition with the United States and the arms race. At that time, some negotiations were taking place. So there were some treaties signed between the United States and the Soviet Union. But internally, things were not that good, right? So he also proposed to have a policy of glasnost, which is a policy of openness, when people were allowed to criticize the government and actually express their views freely. And you can imagine, actually, people began to express a lot of criticism. In terms of foreign policy, what happened is that from now on, because Soviet Union did not have any, ambitions of being a dominant force, either globally or in terms of just leading a socialist movement, now it was willing to negotiate with China on an equal basis, and not treating it as a younger brother anymore. So ties between various non-governmental organizations were also resumed, such as labor unions in Soviet Union and China began again to exchange some activists. The societies on friendship, both in Russia and China, restarted their work. The citizens and experts began to travel again. But what happened is that if in the first period, when things were just starting, when the People's Republic of China was just established, Soviet cultural diplomacy was targeting everyone. Yeah. So the literature, the language courses, everything could be delivered to basically any person in China. But from that period on, it was no longer possible, because Because maybe the older generation had some already embedded stereotypes of the Soviet Union. There was quite a long period when the Soviet Union was painted as a real enemy of China. And then now the Soviets wanted to focus on, I don't know, enlightening the young generation of people. Yeah. What else was going on? Of course, there was some new dynamics in terms of Cold War, and China was playing its own role in it. And it also affected the way cultural diplomacy was carried out. It was less intense than in the first period, but at least it was happening, taking place again. This is something. You see the Deng Xiaoping together with Gorbachev here on the picture, and you see some Tiananmen Square photographs. Okay, so the first part is over. Quite a lot of information I'm feeding you, huh? I hope you are not tired. Are you? Maybe I will come. We can, interact face to face would be better, because I like engaging audience. I don't really like to just keep talking myself. Normally I interact a lot, but now it's just a bit complicated. Okay, we don't have much time, and I have to really give quite a lot of information, quite a lot of interesting stuff. So let's move on. So last time I introduced to you the idea of soft power, which contrasts with hard power, and which is basically a power of influence that is attained by building networks, communicating compelling narratives, the narratives that can be appealing to the publics of foreign countries. You establish international rules, and basically you just lead by example. People want to do what you do. They want to be like you, just because you speak nicely and your maybe model of governance is nice. Yeah. So Joseph Nye, who was a scientist who introduced this concept, he identified three key parameters. So you have political values that can be appealing. You have culture that can be rich and vivid and attract people. And you also have some foreign policy. Maybe it is a virtuous foreign policy. Maybe you are giving some humanitarian aid to people who suffer in disasters, or I don't know, you support some freedom fighters, whatever. Like, you basically do something that is morally right in terms of foreign policy, or just something that's smart, that the beneficiaries, the subjects of your policies like, and then it also elevates your status globally. However, Joseph Nye himself acknowledges that the soft power has its limits. So let's say everybody likes your culture, or there is a group of countries who like your culture, who like your political values, but it does not mean right away that you will be more successful in foreign policy, for example. No. So another idea was introduced as smart power, which is a combination of soft and hard power measures. So for example, people say, like, there was a discussion in the United States that basically our soft power does not work in the Muslim world somehow. The Arabs don't give in. They don't want to. For them, the democratic values somehow are not appealing. Maybe just because the method was not a very good one in the first place, that the United States chose to promote it. But anyway, somehow there was recently an article on the irrelevance of soft power. The authors argue that basically, again, we have this geopolitical struggle, we have the alliances fighting each other. Maybe soft power is not as important as before. And the authors cited an example of Russians using a very hard power measures on the terrorists and seeing them actually liking Russia better in the end. So that was like an illustration that sometimes hard power is necessary. Some nice, interesting books here. you have the Bound to Lead by Joseph Nye himself, and you have a contrasting opinion. This is a scholar who argues that the United States does not do the right thing, that basically NATO is a dangerous dinosaur, yeah, that it only causes problems in the world. So maybe the very idea that the United States has to lead is a flawed one. Yeah, so of course, there are always divergences. Can you hear me? Is everything good? The internet connection? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. I hope you can hear me, right? Okay, let's continue then. So to actually project the soft power, you clearly need some skills such as emotional intelligence, but you also have to have actually a vision to offer to the others, right? If you want to lead by example, you actually have to offer some kind of a product, an idea, or a model of socioeconomic functioning of society. And you have to be able to communicate what you have to offer in a good manner, yeah, so that people will understand it and will actually give into it. Yeah, so again, the smart power is an idea that you have to combine both the soft power projection and sometimes to step in and use some hard power measures when it's necessary. However, Joseph Nye himself emphasized that if you only function in a top-down manner, yeah. So let's say you're like a kingdom on a hill. You just look top-down to everyone and try to like teach everyone how to live. This is not going to work because people don't like being treated this way, and this is not going to deliver any positive results. Some of the information here you will maybe want to consult later on your own. I would here just like to mention that why in the first place do we want to assess the efficiency of the soft power measures being used? First of all, because you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you have some state-related agencies that want to understand if what they're doing is efficient. You have to somehow measure if it's a good idea to invest money in this program or maybe not. But you cannot really guarantee anything because a lot of things here are outside of state control. So for example, you create a message, you deliver a message, but the audience in the foreign state is not receptive. It does not really understand, or it does not like what you do. And so your soft power influence does not grow at all. Yeah. And also, how to understand if you change the public opinion or not. You can conduct public polls. You can ask people how much they like your country or its policies. But you cannot really be sure if it's because of your soft power programs or because of some other factors that affected the public opinion. Another issue is that for the attitude of foreign publics to a certain country to change, you need a long-term strategy, and you need really a long time to see the change, to track the change. And for state officials, for any political figures in the government, normally the terms of their service are short, so they are not motivated to act for the long term. Right, and there is an assessment that you need at least 20 years to rebrand the country. So let's say everyone thinks your country is a bad one, like has some negative associations with the country, and you want to change the image, you have to really sit down and think what to do. And at least you need 20 years. You see all of these images on the slide. These are some of the private companies, some of the commercial companies that were previously providing services to businesses, but now increasingly the states hire those agencies to help improve their images. Can you imagine? So, for example, Balsera Communications, I think president in Peru, once hired them to bolster his own image in the country or globally. Russia was also hiring this company Ketchum at some point. I'm not sure when, maybe in 2014. Russia also I think hired this Goldman Sachs company to help improve the expectations of potential investors, right? Because foreign direct investment also depends a lot on what people expect from your country. If they think there is a good business environment, they will invest. If the country is politically unstable, less investors are willing to come and to invest. And Russia had this problem back then because of some of the political issues, but I think it also continues now to some extent because the conditions for business could really be improved. So the trap in measuring soft power influence is that it's always easy to try to measure something that is tangible, like how many people enrolled in your language courses. Maybe many of them enrolled. How can you actually measure like how many people started to like your country better? That's a little bit trickier. You cannot really be sure like if it was what you have done that caused the change in the attitude. So normally the scales that measure soft power, they are comparative. What people do, they choose some parameters of soft power, and then they compare the countries to one another. But it's really, again, complicated because you have a country that is economically strong, that spends a lot of money onto, I don't know, maybe like social services. Another country that is completely capitalist in this respect, has no social problems at all. You have a country where you have strong cultural values, you have a strong culture, I don't know, India, China. You have a country with a so-called weak culture, more individualistic, and you compare them by one parameter. It can be tricky. Plus, who are those people who actually create those rankings? If you have like a government attached institute, let's say this Institute for Government in the Kingdom, or the Real Instituto Elcano in the Royal Academy in Spain, they might be motivated by some subjective things, such as maybe they want to please the government they're serving, right? Or let's say it's a commercial company that creates a ranking. Again, maybe this company wants to shape the public opinion. It produces a ranking where whatever, the United States ranks first. Everybody thinks, oh, the United States ranks first. It's like a manipulation tool. Plus, mostly, who are those? Where do these companies come from? For the most part, these are Western think tanks and companies who produced these rankings. So they might be, and they clearly are biased. They have a very pro-Western outlook. They, so they maybe pay attention to tolerance, to democracy, to trade freedom. And we all understand that for a country that is stable and rich, perhaps the freedom of trade is more beneficial than for a country that is not yet very developed, that wants to introduce some protectionist measures. So again, that's a disbalance. It can be biased. Right. So what is normally being measured? You measure a state's potential. What resources does it have to be used for soft power projection? For example, it can be rich culture. It can be strong democratic institutions. These are all resources. It can be, I don't know, maybe a good foreign policy. Your neighbors like you. That's already a resource, some kind of an attitude resource. Secondly, you assess the practical tools a state is applying. For example, you have a cultural institute that organizes some exhibitions, or you have the programs of internships available for foreigners. These are some specific tools, and you can assess how efficient those tools are in making your country to be seen more favorably. And lastly, you can measure the effect on the target audience. Let's say you polled the people in a country. You understood that, okay, people, maybe like 40% of the people think your country is a good one. Then you introduce some of the programs, student exchanges, exhibitions, movies. Yeah, you make your culture more visible, more understandable for others. And then in like 20 years, you have another opinion poll, or you see that there is more foreign direct investment coming into a country, and you say, okay, we did really well. Yeah, we succeeded at what we wanted to achieve. But another issue is that sometimes many of these rankings only are conducted in just a limited number of countries, such as a group of 8, for example. And again, that's a distorted picture. Okay, let's see. Yeah, clearly you have to choose your target audience well as well. So maybe this audience is not receptive, is not interested in even talking about your country, and nothing helps. Some of the pictures here later, you can just see it for yourself. These are some of the indexes, yeah? So you can see some categories used: governance, people, experts, tourism, culture, and heritage. You see, for example, after Trump was elected in 2016, the ranking of the United States dropped internationally. Then it was back. This is a feature of the public opinion on the United States. It fluctuates between the presidents. It can be very high under Obama. It can be very low under Trump, for example. For China, it's different. I mean, for any other country that is not really functioning in these democratic cycles. Yeah, again, some examples of the commercial companies that offer their services. This is a reputation track. So you can also measure countries' reputation. It's part of the soft power. And you can also combine several parameters all together. Yeah. So let's say a country ranks well on like all of these. Yeah. Then it's the best country. You have some country that ranks highly on some of these, but maybe not so well on others. It's less influential, yeah, in some altogether. And now this is the final stage, final section. We're going to look into soft power and public diplomacy of contemporary Russia and then of contemporary China. Yeah, this is a very interesting topic. I do not pay too much of an attention to the institutions, yeah, to the administrative bodies, how they were changing, how they were evolving. But I will talk more about the content, about the idea that was embedded, yeah, into some of the national documents, such as this foreign policy strategy, national security strategy. You can really track what country thinks of itself, what kind of an identity it espouses, by looking closely at these kind of documents. So after Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, of course, for Russia, it was a very painful period. Later, you also had a conflict between the executive branch and the judicial branch of power, where the executive took over under Yeltsin. Yeltsin was the president after Gorbachev and before Putin. Basically, the position of president strengthened a lot in the Yeltsin period, which might not be a very good thing, but here we are. What we have today is a legacy of that period to a large extent. So, of course, initially, what was Russia's goal in terms of foreign policy? Russia wanted to once again become a key player of international relations, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was, of course, a weak state. It had to change its economy. It had to like really do everything from the scratch, basically, to redefine itself. So initially this was the idea, but when Putin came to power in 2000, Russia was already one of the major players. So it, you know, somehow it managed to restructure its economy. Somehow it managed to consolidate power. We had some wars in with some republics that wanted to leave Russia. So it also became a little bit more militarized than earlier. And then in 2008, after the famous speech of Putin at the Munich Security Conference, Russia, the idea that was added to Russia's global foreign policy strategy was that Russia is not just one of the major players, but it also has a global responsibility. You have now this kind of a missionary aspect added to the foreign policy. And a change in terms of positioning, self-positioning, was also seen in what concerned to the public diplomacy domain. So in 2000, it was stipulated that Russia just wants to project a positive image, because clearly its image was damaged somehow by the Soviet Union, by some of the things that were known to the world of the Soviet Union. But now in 2008, Russia felt maybe more self-assured. So now the idea was we try to inform the foreign publics of what Russia actually is. We don't try to pretend we're good. In a sense, you want us to be good. Yeah, we don't want to just be liked. We just want you to understand what's inside. Yeah, what's actually happening in Russia. And in terms of some institutional restructuring, you had a previously independent body now integrated into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in 2002, another aspect was added to its work, meaning the strengthening of ties with compatriots living abroad. Because you had the Community of Independent States. It was a new organization established after the fall of the Soviet Union, including, Ukraine, Belarus, some countries in the Central Asia that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. And of course, Russian language was widespread, a little bit less today, but still is spoken in Central Asia. Partly this happened because Russia became disillusioned with the West. It realized that the West does not want to change its approach to Russia. So we just changed the orientation. Putin himself in 2004, I think, mentioned or recognized the importance of projecting, of, doing something, of making some efforts to be more transparent to the outside world. That Russia's image globally is far from being objective and we have to change it. And just in a couple of years, you already had some initiatives launched. You had the Ruski Mir Foundation established. It mostly deals with popularizing Russia's language and culture, again, with focus on the compatriots living abroad and the Community of Independent States. And you had also Россотрудничество. Well, it kind of inherited some of the former structures, but it was a new body. And it has quite a wide range of competences, again, mostly having to do with promoting Russia's culture. I added the links to the websites here. They all have English language versions, clearly, because these are public diplomacy initiatives. They're aimed at foreign publics, not exclusively at them, but partly also at the foreign publics. So if you just want, you can access it. You can look up. There are always some competitions also for foreigners, some exchange programs, etc. Maybe not now with COVID-19, but generally, yes. Another very crucial aspect is, of course, media. So you had Russia Today, formed in 2005. So basically this channel is running in several languages. I'm not sure if there is a version in Chinese, but must be. However, it's not really, we cannot really tell. They are very successful, especially with regards to changing the view on Russia in the West. So you can see this picture in the green. RT is the abbreviation of Russia Today. The art of war, because especially in the NATO alliance, and especially after the Ukraine crisis in 2014, there is increasingly more talk about the so-called hybrid warfare and hybrid threats emanating from Russia. Wait. And part of it is the messaging. Yeah, so Russia Today is viewed as a propaganda tool sometimes, maybe because it does not really do enough to assess what foreign publics are thinking and to adapt its messages to what foreign publics are believing, actually. So it's like a little bit of a top-down messaging. You just disseminate information without asking for feedback. So you have many bodies, I mentioned some of them, that are all involved in public diplomacy, but there is quite poor coordination between them. And it's a problem because you can say that Russia does not really have a unified strategy in terms of public diplomacy. So sometimes you have just some top-level politicians, they order something to be done, and this is just being done through those structures, but without consultations between them, right? And you have very little cooperation between state and non-state agencies. And as we talked last time, we discussed last time, that the new public diplomacy, assumes that you have a really crucial role for various non-government agents. Okay, this is an example of a slide that really has a lot of text on it. It is meant for those of you who maybe would like to delve deeper into this topic, because it summarizes everything which is wrong with Russia's public diplomacy efforts, why they're not being as successful as they could have been. Because if you just look at the public opinion polls, there was no significant increase in favorability in Russia's rankings. Partly it's because there is no consistent messaging. So let's say internationally, Russia posits itself as a cooperative country that has like very positive intentions. But on the other hand, it has some conflicts on its borders. And maybe the West does not understand why this is happening, or thinks that Russia is an aggressor, or Russia just does not do enough to justify its position. Yeah, so just not a very, the messaging is not very clear, not very on point, and maybe there's just not enough of conversation, not enough of dialogue. But as one of the Russia's state officials claimed herself, we do not really understand what values we want to live up to. So if we just want to remain an influential power, this is not a strategy. This is not really a vision, because this is something that's very self-focused, right? This is not something you are offering to others so that others would like to follow your lead. It's just a very self-absorbed, self-consumed picture. And I think what it signifies, what it indicates, is just that Russia is not quite certain about its identity yet. So let's say we did not come to terms with the communist past. In some respects, we even reject the communist past, but we try to rely on pre-Soviet Russia, so some of the imperial narratives, but in today's world, they're not particularly appropriate, right? So maybe this is a problem. Yeah, so we have to be more receptive towards foreign publics and adapt our messaging to them, to tailor our messaging to the foreign publics. We have to be more consistent in communication. We have to be not to send mixed signals, because this is not going to create trust, and we have to be more clear ourselves about our own goals. And now let's talk about China. So I largely discussed Soviet cultural diplomacy, not China's cultural diplomacy. However, I mentioned that China was carrying, quite substantial propaganda. It was throwing quite a lot of attention into third world countries, into gaining some influence in those countries that were stepping onto this path of liberation. But of course, there could be no talk of some sort of feedback, because, these countries had no experience of democracy. These countries did not really have a very literate population. So you would not expect to be having any sort of feedback, really. So you can say that this was a propaganda. Propaganda sounds like a negative word. Mostly, it is just about imposing your message, or just sort of a unilateral communication, right? So whereas public diplomacy is supposed to be two ways communication, you speak, you hear the person out, you speak again. So it's sort of a dialogue. In propaganda, you just speak, right? So you just say, okay, this is what it is. This is the truth. This is how things work. That's it, right? That's the major difference. And then I mentioned again that even though the United States and China established full diplomatic ties in 1979, there were some issues, such as human rights issues. Not just that, but also that, of course, you always have some mutual suspicions between the countries, which are powerful. No matter how much you talk about your peaceful rise, that you have only good intentions, you do not want to crack down on anyone, you do not want to become a monopoly on a global market. Anyway, no one can be sure, because in politics, words are words. You cannot really trust them like this. So after this Tiananmen incident, China was sanctioned. So there were some foreign states, mostly in the West, of course, capitalist states, that imposed sanctions on China in terms of trade, maybe somehow in some other respects. And China in the 1990s paid much more attention to dialogue and exchanging information, because the Chinese government understood we are, undertaking reforms internally, but we want to also be seen positively externally. It might be helpful for us in many respects, in terms of political recognition, but also in terms of economy. If you want to have good trade balance, good economic ties with some markets outside, of the region, you have to really pay attention to being seen as a positive, as a constructive actor. Then you have this epidemic in 2003, and it was seen as a very dangerous event for the image of China. So it really prompted the establishment of the system of public diplomacy. So you had some institutions set up to carry out the various soft power initiatives. And then in 2007, this is normally cited as a focal point, as a starting point for all of the following initiatives for the intensification of China's soft power efforts. This is the speech of the then President Hu Jintao, in which he basically said that, okay, rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, if we want to really be seen, and you as a good actor that is now having a different path and really just wants to bring good to everyone and coexist with everyone, we have to deploy soft power. It sounds like a military term, to deploy soft power. Maybe you remember last time when I was talking about the cultural diplomacy during the Cold War, I also mentioned that there was a so-called weaponization of culture when the United States and the Soviet Union, they were kind of advertising themselves to the others. For the Soviet Union, they were mostly advertising it for other socialists. Yeah, the United States wanted to let itself be known to everyone, but because the USSR did not allow much transparency for exchange of information, so that wasn't possible. But that happened anyway somehow. And a major event, really maybe like a key event that changed the course of China's soft power efforts was the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. There was actually a controversy because the Chinese government hired a Western agency to help it boost its image internationally. And the people in China were thinking like, why are we even doing this? Like, why do we need to ask someone from the West to help us be seen better in the West? Kind of strange. Like, are we independent or what? But at the same time, China also partly because there were so many things happening inside of the country. When there is like a tumultuous period internally, a country is not always able to devote a lot of attention to the external world, to how it is being seen internationally. Sometimes, which was and maybe remains the case for China, the state is much more concerned with the internal climate. Yeah, what citizens think of what's going on in the country. So the government wants to keep its legitimacy in the eyes of the citizens, and so it really cares much less for what others think. But today, because China is gaining more influence globally, it has to care more, and it does care more. Yeah, some of the pictures. 2007 was a year of China in Russia. You also had some years of Russia in China. Besides the Beijing Olympics, you had Shanghai Expo in 2010. You had the Guangzhou Asian Olympic Games. Maybe I think I mentioned last time, some big events, international events, is a good soft power tool because you can really showcase what you have. Yeah, and you can actually present yourself in a positive light. Another interesting development of that period, because I try to be historically on point here, was a formation of the group of countries named BRICS. You maybe know this is a group of emerging economies, so to say. You have Brazil, you have India, you have China, you see Xi Jinping in the center, you have Russia, and you have South Africa. These countries are relatively the same in terms of the GDP, or in terms of like economic dynamics somehow. So you can see they're forming a block which is not maybe very monolith. This block is not maybe strong enough. It is more economically united than politically. The same you can say about the European Union. The basis of cooperation is more economic than political, even though political cooperation is also considerable. So what China currently does in terms of soft power, it tries to follow three principles that seem to be very reasonable. So it tries to enhance its public relationships with countries like the United States, Russia, and like the rest of the West, to build a positive image. And it has to also tackle some of the issues faced by Russia. So it has to face and rebuff the accusation of neocolonialism, because the Western media is very powerful and it paints sometimes a very negative picture of Russia. We have the same thing, and of China. And partly because of what's happening in the South China Sea, because of what's happening in Tibet, in Hong Kong, elsewhere. So China also wants to stabilize public relations with neighboring countries. This is always very important. You have some territorial disputes. You had them, I think, 2011, 12 in particular. And, I think I just gave you an example last time. You want to establish a Confucius Institute in Manila, in Philippines, but the climate is already not very good because you have some territorial disputes and your export of culture does not really help you. So you have to first address the issue, which is primary. And lastly, and this is the direction in which China is doing particularly well, China wants to reinforce its positive image in the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So Confucius Institute was established in 2004. Now it's a whole network, it's everywhere. You had also the Central China Television, establishing a branch, for example, in North America, but not only there. And you have a lot of internet activity, but it is mostly overseen by the government. However, as I mentioned again, not everything is going very well. These efforts are not necessarily very successful, and we have some shared issues. So the issues are similar to what to the obstacles that Russia is facing in terms of soft power projection. The image is inconsistent. So on the other hand, China paints itself as a very virtuous, peaceful country. But when you look at some of the social developments, some of the human rights issues, the West, the West cannot quite give in because it sees that like China says one thing, but maybe internally it's not the other. What I believe again is that you just have to be able to justify what you're doing, because if you're just doing something, others believe you are evil and you just stay silent, you don't say anything, right? You cannot just justify yourself. You just don't answer. And of course, you will not be heard if you don't say anything. So that's the problem. If you can somehow defend your point of view, defend your actions, maybe you will be better received. And I personally believe you don't really want to, it's not maybe a good goal to just do everything to be liked, because as I mentioned in Russia's 2008 strategy, there was an idea that we just want to be understood. We don't necessarily want to be liked. And maybe China also has to like pay more attention to that. And it actually does. Things are going on, something is happening. Confucius Institute, unfortunately, cannot be, viewed as a 100% success, because it is viewed in some countries in the West, in particular, as a threat. So they say that like China is just trying to, lead these aggressive cultural initiatives. It's always good to popularize one's language, but maybe something has to be adjusted here. And again, because also a very vertical system of public diplomacy. You have some agencies, but mostly the central government decides what policy line is to be pursued. And in this respect, the non-democratic countries and the allegedly democratic, I don't say that the West is really, an ideal of democracy. This is not true. And especially now, this is not true anymore. But still, somehow, there are many non-governmental agents that are freer in terms of what they do. Yeah. So they can be affected subconsciously by the environment, but still they're not controlled by the government. So that's a disbalance, because neither Russia nor China can really have this many non-governmental agents. Yeah. The citizen diplomacy is not really that strong. However, regional successes, yes, China does have them. Partly also because when the West advocates for human rights and democracy, some regimes that do not want to change, that maybe do not share these values in the first place, they like China better because it offers an alternative, right? But again, maybe another issue is that maybe the West is more interested in being regarded positively, right? Because as I mentioned, the Communist Party mostly cares for how it's seen internally, and it is willing to sacrifice its image abroad as long as its domestic audience is undisturbed. We are approaching the end of the lecture, but just a couple of final remarks. So you see here, maybe you know his name. I kind of forgot his name. I think it's like Ma, the Chinese writer who received a Nobel Prize in the recent years, and he was not able to attend the ceremony. Unfortunately, that was quite a scandal. But then the state tried to somehow privatize his achievements. This is not really helping China's global image. But then another issue is that, for example, when we talk about Russia's cultural diplomacy in contemporary China, you maybe can also confirm that Chinese youth is much more interested in the West now. Yeah. So you have this funny picture below. I don't know if it's true, but it just gives you an idea that basically the Chinese youth is more kind of engaged in the Western culture and wants to get to know more of the Western culture. If we talk about Hollywood, for example, too, right? So the Hollywood, the American movies are being watched in China really, like everyone is watching them, right? Even China also wanted to cooperate with Hollywood, and they did collaborate on some movies together. But the United States is a little bit suspicious of that because it thinks, again, China wants to project its influence using Hollywood. But the idea is that even I heard the Chinese governments try to limit the access of the youth to the Western, cultural products, not to, abandon our own cultural heritage. And yeah, Russia also faces this very tough competition with the West on this cultural field. Let's see how it goes, because the content of the culture, what these cultures have to offer, they are different. Maybe we cannot speak loudly about what philosophers were writing, yeah, or some classical music that we have in Russia. Or maybe it's just the idea that pop culture is a Western product, and pop culture is much easier to be spread than a more classical, yeah, a more internally focused culture, which I also think is the case for China, because a lot of Chinese cultural heritage is also about like reflection, patience sometimes. So let's see, maybe the issue here is that the definition of soft power and the practice of today's soft power is inherently inherently favors the liberal democracies, just because the very notion of soft power and the very opportunities you have to spread it are better suited for the political and social systems existing in the West, which does not mean we cannot do anything. But I think what it primarily means is that we have to better understand what we want, where we go, and how we want to be seen. Not necessarily to be liked, but just to, feel good about ourselves. So, thank you for attention. I spoke quite a lot today. If you have any questions, you can, of course, try to ask me now, or you can just, send me a message, or through maybe Ocean will address me some of your questions. But anyway, I really hope I will be able to come to China sooner or later and see you. This is it. I will, of course, make the presentation available to you so you can revise everything I talked about today. Thank you. Goodbye.